Hi, I'm Erica Crompton. I'm a service user and a journalist, and today I'm going to be talking about psychiatry in the media. So, a little bit about me. I'm a mental health campaigner. I write about living with psychosis and schizoaffective disorder for the national press. I've got a history of paranoid schizophrenia. I've had one hospitalisation. And today I work part-time from home with my two cats, Casper and Winter. I'm working on my first book. It's called The Beginner's Guide to Sanity, and it's a self-help book for all people with psychosis. And I'm writing that with Professor Stephen Laurie, a psychiatrist in Edinburgh. That will be out on Hammersmith Health Books January next year. Overall, I feel quite happy and content with my life. I don't feel that schizophrenia and happiness is an oxymoron. I think that you can sort of thrive rather than just survive with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So that's a little bit about me. Overview of the talk. It's going to last about 50 minutes to an hour. I'm going to look at how psychosis presents to me. I think that there's so many different experiences of psychosis and schizophrenia and all the schizospectrum disorders that I'm just going to look at what it meant to me and my experience of that. Experiences of stigma, so I'll talk a little bit about some of the stigma I've experienced and how being open and honest has helped me. Schizophrenia doesn't stop me from working. I'll go into that briefly. How writing helps me manage schizophrenia. Well, working in the media as a journalist has actually been really beneficial to me as a person with schizophrenia. I'm going to look a little bit about that and how writing is so special to me. Writing works for me, but it's actually class in the media that hinders me. So I think that maybe most people would think that it was schizophrenia that had held me back in my career, but I actually think in the media it is a class issue. So I'll look a little bit about that, and I'll be giving a reading from an article I wrote about that in the Metro. Bringing my own kind of madness to the office. This is something I wrote about in the New York Times. I think that most journalists are office-based, most journalists, editors, writers, etc. So I look a bit about the office experience as a person with schizophrenia. The other side of the media, so the kind of it's kind of like a new wave of journalism where people are talking about their mental health more honestly. So look a little bit about that. Challenging the stigma. I'm going to show you today a film about Medfed, my fashion label for people with psychosis, and it uses like fashion as a vehicle to challenge grey stereotypes of people with psychosis in the media. I can't show that on the video because I don't know how technically to do that. So I'll just sort of say a few words briefly about what Medfed is. Then I'll talk about Hope Scene, which is a more recent project. It's my little magazine to help all people feeling low, give them hope for a brighter future. And then there'll be like 10 minutes for questions at the end. So that's an overview of what I'll be talking about. So to start off, how psychosis looks to me. This is an article I wrote in 2010. This was published just after I'd been in hospital. It was one of the first big splashes to let a person with the mental health experience tell their story in their own words. I think a lot of people do that now today. We'll be looking at that more later on. But this is I'm Mad But Not Bad. It's a double page splash in the Independent. Okay, so the onset was fast. It was December 2003, and the midnight screech of police sirens, usually no more than irritating, suddenly seemed deafening and unbearable. Sleepless and paranoid, I would run to the house at 3 a.m. seeking spy equipment. In the daytime, flickering TVs and wrong number callers to my mobile, things others would hardly register, seemed to signal imminent danger. And hovering helicopters zoomed in on my every move with sophisticated zoom lens technology. At the time, I believed that I was at the centre of a conspiracy populated by quasi-terrorist gang of scriptwriters, songwriters and presenters who communicated with me via the TV, radios and computers. The group of people who I believed lived in London art squats wanted me to suffer excruciating lifelong pain in prison. After 6 weeks of terror, no sleep, and trying to explain my conspiracy theory to anyone who would listen, including the local police, my mother took me to the GP. Your thoughts aren't quite right, Erica, he explained calmly. I protested, but I'm sure these people are out to get me. I can provide evidence. I think we should get you in with a psychiatrist as soon as possible, he said. I thought he was a total idiot for not believing me and having no interest in what I thought was revolutionary criminal activity in the heart of London's art squats. A few days later, I had a consultation with a psychiatrist. This was at St George's Hospital in Stafford, otherwise dubbed by locals as the local nut house, regarded generally as a place populated by the pitiful. I agreed with the psychiatrist that I'd try a medication called amisulpride, an antipsychotic, on a daily basis, but I remained convinced that these squatters were after me, despite the psychiatrist referring to my theory as a false belief. Still, I responded well to the medication and stabilised quickly. It wasn't until much later on that I was diagnosed with paranoid psychosis. At the time, I wondered if I had schizophrenia, as that's what the tablet's leaflet says it helps. It was a little confusing. Nevertheless, my family were relieved that I was getting help and generally didn't mention it to friends, partly because I believed they were in on the conspiracy too, and also I could rationalise that if I told them I thought they were part of a conspiracy with Julian, it might be quite offensive. I now know psychosis is not a condition in itself, but a symptom. Around 1 in 200 people will have a psychotic episode at some point and may find it hard to distinguish between what is real and what is imagined, sometimes hearing or seeing things that are not there. Sufferers are often terrified, so the fear they inspire in others seems ironic to me. The worst reaction came from my employers. Shortly after seeking help and seeing the psychiatrist, but before the medication has taken full effect, I broke down in the office reception. A man had come in to fix the office fax machine, but I believed he was storing spy equipment into it to monitor me. I cried and spoke of my conspiracy theory, which apparently translated to colleagues as gibberish. I spoke for about 10 minutes before calming down. Then I took 2 days off before returning to work. The following week, I mentioned I had a doctor's appointment, but omitted to mention that it was a follow-up with the psychiatrist. However, my boss inquired, "Is this to do with what happened the other day?" And I said yes. Very shortly afterwards, I was called to a meeting with my boss and the office manager, and they said that what had happened meant I couldn't do the job. There was too much risk that it might happen again. I was speechless for all but a few minutes before being shown the back door to save any embarrassment. While they outlined my right to appeal, I was in no state for an employment battle and felt ashamed anyway. Despite the fact that I was quickly stabilising on medication at this point, the impact of such treatment led me to contemplate suicide. The terror had subsided, but I was left feeling hopeless and desperate. If I wasn't part of a plot, then I was insane. It felt like a lose-lose situation in which I'd be locked up either way, and I'd lost my job. I couldn't see a way out, but I had all these pills to hand. As luck would have it, I received 3 text messages from friends as I stared at a handful of pills under the duvet. It was enough to put the pills down and put the kettle on to mull things over. Days later, I drastically decided to move to New York, to run away. I'd lived there briefly before and found it a great place to dissolve into. My life was a mess, I'd had a trauma, and I needed to go away for a bit. Before departing to the States, I remember peering over a nurse's shoulder at my medical notes as I was getting undressed for a smear. Psychotic. There it was. It was a frightening word. Even I was afraid of me and what I thought I would do. And although I was stabilised on medication at this point, I still feared prison as much as I feared being sectioned. It took a long time for me to realise that I wasn't a threat to other people. So it doesn't surprise me that the anti-stigma campaign Time to Change found that 44% of people in the UK believe people with a mental health diagnosis are potentially violent. If that's the case, what good is a diagnosis? My official one is paranoid psychosis, but various psychiatrists have suggested I use nervous disorder or even the slightly odd acute disability when I raise it with potential employers. According to Mind, more than half of people would not employ the person they thought was best candidate during an interview if they disclosed a mental health problem. The general consensus is that I got sick through a combination of stress and smoking skunk, which ironically I was doing to quell the stress. However, since 2003, I've been taking medication and successfully managing my psychosis without too much problem. And I also try and talk frankly about it through my writing and talks. However, stigma still looms. Since returning from New York, I've experienced ostracism and many foster reception from groups and individuals while working in PR, retail, and moonlighting as a journalist. Rebuffs like this are mostly the result of slightly eccentric ideas I share with colleagues without thinking them through. I often feel anxious around people, which sometimes makes me act in haste. I'm so sensitive to these results that they only compound my paranoid thoughts that people are out to get me. It's upsetting. So much so that today I work from home as a freelance journalist in order to avoid other people and contact with other people as much as possible. Before going freelance full-time last year, writing articles, I was teaching at a university, and some of my students at the time started a link on Facebook which ridiculed the paranoid symptoms I'd shared in a newspaper interview that was still on the internet. The comments were really unpleasant. It was a rude awakening, and I concur that the worst part of my so-called mental illness is what society thinks it means. People too often forget that there's a difference between mad and bad. During my meltdown in 2003, I didn't squash a fly, nor did I go on a murder spree, blow up any buildings, or run around naked with banana at my bottom. A friend with a diagnosis of bipolar illness sometimes believes that she's a Hindu god. How many Hindu gods do you know that would act in such a ridiculous way? It might be the response of a sane person to get the facts before passing judgment or forming an opinion. According to Mind, it's a fact that there's more chance of being killed by lightning than by someone with a mental illness. Compared with all killings, the number committed by people with mental health problems has actually fallen to little more than 1 in 10, and only a fraction of those are attacked by random strangers. Arguably, more people will experience psychotic symptoms without ever receiving a diagnosis of a mental health problem. So does my diagnosis mean I'm mad? No more than you are, I think. So long as it's managed with medication, I'm okay and not overwhelmingly or astoundingly paranoid or psychotic. I have a small circle of close friends that are the best in the world. I work independently and have started my own fashion label, MedFed, which is colourful and fun. It aims to challenge the bleak mental health stereotypes that are often in the media. In groups and with individuals, I'm still a little awkward, even angry sometimes. I get nervous, sweaty or excited around new, loud, terribly clever or attractive people. Tories tend to scare me somewhat too, but that's surely the response of a sane person. So that's my experience of psychosis. It's more sort of delusions rather than visual hallucinations. Just to give you some context about my experience going forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about stigma here. So you've heard that I got fired from a couple of jobs simply because I had a diagnosis. The lecturing job, what happened there was that the students had got hold of an article I'd written for the Mirror, and they shared it on Facebook, and another lecturer had seen it. She went to the dean, they went to HR, they went through my notes. They'd seen that I hadn't declared I had a mental illness, which I hadn't because I thought that they'd discriminate against me. And they said because I'd lied on the application form, it was gross misconduct. I was taken out of a class that was halfway through. I was taken to the dean's office and I was fired with instant effect and sent home. Again, it was a little bit like being shown the back door, like it was as the receptionist, and that was really horrible. I think the stigma can also come from medical professionals too. I know that while I was applying for jobs as a journalist, an editorial assistant, and editor, I was getting frustrated. I've been doing this for a while, about 4 months, when I first started thinking about going back to work. And I'd had a general checkup with my GP, and I ran this past him about the frustrations I had with not finding any suitable employment. He says, what kind of jobs are you looking for? And I told him journalism jobs. And he says, well, you know, the diagnosis like schizophrenia, maybe you could set your sights a little bit lower. You know, there's a lot of local work for part-time cleaners and stuff like that, he was suggesting. And I did actually get a journalism job 2 weeks later. But I think this kind of having medical professionals having such low expectations of people with schizophrenia is really unhelpful. And I did get a journalism job in that instance. So that's a little bit about my experiences with stigma. And I do think that a lot has changed since I first wrote my Mad Not Bad article. People are talking more. I think that illnesses that are more prevalent, like depression and anxiety, are more accepted. But I think there's still some way to go with schizophrenia and psychosis and personality disorders. There's still some stigma there, but not as bad as it used to be. So since the lecturing job, I've been open and honest about having psychosis, and this really helped me. So it was 2000. It was around the time just before Mad Not Bad was published. I was working as a lecturer, and then I was writing for a little bit about living with psychosis. And then in 2014, I went to a conference to speak about stigma in schizophrenia. And I met a professor there, Stephen Lorry, my co-author of the book, and we've done a lot of work together on articles since. But the introduction was that he invited me to give a guest lecture to his department in Edinburgh, and I accepted. And it was the first time I'd given a talk or a lecture since I was fired from that job. But this time I wasn't hiding anything. I wasn't fearful of stigma. You know, Stephen had read all my articles and he knew exactly my experience, and I was supported. I got a bit nervous just before I went into the room, into the lecture theatre, and Stephen just reassured me that it was going to be fine, and even if I just could speak for 10 minutes, and that was fine as well, which was good. So it was a good lecture. It did last a little bit longer than 10 minutes, and yeah, so being open and honest really helped me. And I think it's also worth noting, I'd recently parked a project where I was working with a doctor, a psychologist, to start a new business. And he's so stressed with work at the moment, he's having to take time off sick. But I think there's an added pressure when you are a doctor that you can't say that you're ill, you know. He wants to take time off with stress, but he feels he can't go to his boss and say that. So I think, yeah, you know, it's really helpful if you can be open and honest, but it's understandable if you can't, but you really should be. Is my point there. So that helps. So schizophrenia doesn't stop me from lecturing or giving talks anymore. And I've written about, I'm not the only one that feels like this, that being open and honest is the way forward. I've written about this for The Guardian, where I interviewed Ellen Sachs about her experience, and she's written a book as well, so she also has experience of schizophrenia portrayals in psychiatry and the media with her book. So, and the article also talks about some interventions that are useful in academia that could also probably be useful in journalism too. So this is published in The Guardian. It's called Why Schizophrenia Need Not Rob Us of a Life in Academia. So, on an autumn afternoon in 2009, I was fired from my job as a university lecturer. I hadn't declared my schizophrenia on an application form, and this was treated as gross misconduct. Many years later, I returned to the lecture theatre, but this time I was open about my condition to a much more positive response. I learned an important lesson, that if I'm open about living with a mental illness, I can receive the support that I need. I've since continued to work, and I found it good for developing my sense of self-worth. I'm not alone in experiencing this. Ellen Sachs, who also happens to have schizophrenia, is a remarkably high achiever. She first fell ill in 1977 and joined the USC faculty in 1989. She is now a tenured professor of law, psychology, and psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. She's adjunct professor of psychiatry at the UCSD School of Medicine and on the faculty of the New Center for Psychoanalysis. For Sachs, who has authored a book on her experiences of schizophrenia called The Center Cannot Hold, work has been key to recovery. When I'm writing an argument, she says, the crazy stuff recedes to the sidelines. Work gives me a focus and a sense of self-esteem. For me, it's the last thing to go. As I have come to say, my mind is my best friend and my worst enemy. Being an academic with schizophrenia has largely been positive. She wasn't open about her condition at first. I was closeted for the first 2 or 3 years at USC, and then I self-disclosed to 4 people pre-tenure, then another 6 post-tenure, and of course to the whole school on the publication of my memoir, she explains. Her story ended up reaching even further when it was made into an opera. She notes, however, that when it comes to achieving high, she is not one of a kind. People often tell me that I'm unique, but it's just not true, she says. For a paper on psychiatric services, she interviewed about 20 people with high-functioning schizophrenia, including high-flying doctors, lawyers, and the chief executive. She says, our subjects describe techniques they've developed to manage their symptoms, anything from challenging their problematic thoughts to manipulating their surroundings to engaging in spirituality. Stephen Laurie, Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh, agrees that hiring and working with people with schizophrenia is beneficial to their recovery. Through the Scottish Mental Health Research Network, his department works with people with schizophrenia and other illnesses to develop research ideas and projects that will be interesting to and acceptable to patients. Laurie suggests that work can help people feel useful, valued, while also helping others to appreciate the difficulties facing people with schizophrenia and their strength in the face of adversity. He says, there are many benefits to employing people with schizophrenia. In general, if anything, people with schizophrenia are more kind, caring and considerate than the general population. There is also good evidence from clinical trials, he says, that a scheme called individual placement and support, which gets people into competitive employment with training and support on the job, can help people with schizophrenia get jobs and keep them. By giving people jobs, employers can contribute to an increasing understanding and acceptance of the condition, he adds. An example of such inclusive practice can be found at the University of Westminster, which hosts a recovery college tailored to people living with mental illness. A peer support worker, someone with lived experience of mental illness, will work with professional staff to deliver training programs to improve lives. Francesca is one such senior support worker. She says working at the university is an opportunity that is beyond any expectation she had when she was unwell. During my time in hospital, I thought a lot about wanting to use my experience as a way of supporting others in the future in order to help them feel understood and less alone, she says. At the time, I never thought this role would exist. Doing this work gives me a sense of purpose and has given meaning to the difficulties that I went through in the past. It also ensures she stays on track and practices self-care. She says, I believe that my role keeps me motivated to keep well and look after myself in order to support others in doing the same. The responsibility, she says, has added huge value to my daily life and future aspirations. Other universities use mental health first aid training courses to equip staff for dealing with mental health crisis among colleagues and students. Caroline Hounsell, Director of Product Development and Partnerships at Mental Health First Aid England, says, academic staff are facing increased working hours with less resources and more demands, which is taking a toll for those working in higher education. Our training seeks to support staff as well as students because we recognise that both communities are facing unique challenges. Hounsell says there is a real need to educate people on how to spot the signs and symptoms of mental ill health and how to best support someone who might be experiencing difficulties. None of this support was in place when I was lecturing and struggling with my mental health, but I've kept in touch with one or two of the students I worked with during my ill-fated lectureship. One told me that I was the best lecturer she had, and her mother even took me out to lunch recently. So it's important that people with schizophrenia have hope that they can achieve their ambitions and goals. Greater recognition among universities of the need for added support is certainly a welcome development. So that is how things are evolving in academia. You know, things are improving, and I feel the same about my work as a journalist as I do lecturing and giving talks. How can we access support if we're not open about needing it? So I'm going to talk now a little bit more about how writing in particular helps me manage schizophrenia, reading an article I wrote for the Welcome collection about just this. And when I say writing, I mean journalism as much as I do the creative writing that you do get a lot of these kind of workshops in clinical settings. So this was written for the Welcome collection. The poet Dylan Thomas says, "A writer is born scrofulous. His career is an accident dictated by physical or circumstantial disabilities." This has always chimed with me. I'm a writer and I consider my schizophrenia a disability. It's not hard to figure out why the quote makes me smile. Through writing, not just about my disability, but also art and travel, I found a cathartic release that makes a little sense of my life and sickness. The first time I wrote a first-person article about living with psychosis for a national newspaper, I was stunned by the response. I received over 300 emails from others touched by the same illness, directly or through a loved one. People could relate to the struggles I detailed and said my article made them feel less alone. Some simply wanted to give me a hug. I still have friends on Facebook who wanted to add me and keep in touch after reading my piece. Some even wanted to buy me a drink and meet up. That was in 2010. It seems that since then, more and more people with complex illnesses, especially mental illnesses, are taking up writing as a way to cope with their condition. Writing appeals to creative types, and at least for me, it's a great way to channel my flights of ideas. It also feels cathartic to put my problems down on paper. Plenty of academic papers argue that people with mental illnesses are more creative, and while I disagree that I'm artistically superior, I do feel I am better creatively than mathematically. Others feel the same way, such as artist and filmmaker Alice Evans, who has schizoaffective disorder and says that her occupation helps her manage her condition. Writing is a force for good, whether it's journalism, writing my first book, or leading writing workshops. I can write on my laptop in bed if I'm having a bad day, and it doesn't have to be highbrow or highly expressive writing either. I found journalism and blogging to be just as rewarding. Over time, I've been documenting my life, which has allowed me to look at problems from a new light, receive feedback from strangers, and interview psychiatrists. As I only get 15 minutes with my own psychiatrist every 3 months, some advice or comments on a theme from a professional can really help with my decision making, which I struggle with. For example, a number of psychiatrists gave me feedback on psychosis and pregnancy when I was writing about that in my mid-30s. In lieu of time with my own care team, I could gather quotes and stories from professionals to help me decide that maybe having children wasn't right for me at the time. Plus, Googling my own name and finding all my articles is a great way to boost my memory, which can also suffer under schizophrenia. In 2015, I volunteered as a writer in residence on a medium secure psychiatric unit in Staffordshire, where I live. I explained to patients how I go about writing an article, from sourcing ideas in magazines to using short sentences and spell check. The patients then produced newsletters for the wards where they lived, and the occupational therapist who helped set the workshops up saw a real benefit. Once they had the newsletter to hand, they could see other patients reading and enjoying it. They felt a sense of achievement and improved self-esteem. Patients reported on the news on the ward, and one guy weighed up the up-and-coming smoke-free policy on all hospital premises and encouraged other smokers to start cutting down early. Communicating the smoking ban to others helped him work through how he could cope by reducing the number of cigarettes he smoked each day. I could see the relief on his face once he'd drawn his conclusion about how he would work through the smoking ban. I hope the patients whose work were published in the magazine and newsletters might be able to show their writing skills to an employer on discharge, or maybe earn a freelancer's fee writing about how it felt to stay and be discharged from a psychiatric unit. Maybe they could experience the same delight I did when I received 300 emails from my first article about living with psychosis. For me, writing has been emotionally and financially rewarding. Because I have a paying vocation, I have been a homeowner for the last 2 years and no longer need housing benefits. With employment and support allowance and now universal credit and personal independent payments, you can still earn a little money on the side in a way which supports you, which is what I've been doing in and out of employment since the first newspaper article. On a good day, I can go for lunch or take my father for coffee. It's a great feeling. And because I work freelance, I can make my hours fit around my social life and make time for loved ones who have supported me through my illness and suicide attempt. Plus, a healthy work-life balance leaves me with the freedom to regularly attend the GP, therapy, psychiatrist and blood test appointments I need to go to in order to stay well. Much of my 20s was spent in full-time office-based employment, and my condition was hard to manage with so little free time to keep to appointments and pick up prescriptions. And appointments on the NHS are always during office hours too. Managing psychosis can feel like having a part-time job. Sometimes I spend at least 5 days a month travelling to and from appointments. All this makes a regular office job near impossible. The only real drawback to all this is that sometimes I can struggle to get the best assignments with newspapers and magazines. While writing and journalism are perfect for me, the sedative effects of my medication can slow down my brain somewhat. That means I don't always have the sharpest ideas and a lot of them are rejected or ignored. I'm also too tired to work a 5-day week, so I'm not as fast or as productive as a freelance journalist who doesn't have an illness. I feel this is okay, however, and I'm happy to be a small fish in a big pond as it suits my lifestyle and unique needs so well. But writing is a vocation I get a lot out of in so many ways and I enjoy very much. So that's how writing helps me. It has helped me a lot. I'm sort of slowly coming off the universal credit now because I'm getting lots of work in, but I can always keep it in the background and reapply if I need to take time out to manage my mental illness. But I think even if you're working more full-time hours, you know, there's always that option when you sat at the computer that I can go into the room next door and take a lie down if I start to feel anxious. So it's really good for me. I'm going to read something that I wrote from the New York Times, and it follows on from the last slide. You know, I hadn't been so well when I wrote this article a couple of years ago. I wrote it in bed. Most of the editing was done in bed as well. There was a lot of edits to go through on this New York Times piece. But I think it's relevant in this. It's about bringing my own kind of madness to the office. And I think it's relevant in this piece because a lot of my office jobs have been in the media, whether it's a radio script writer or a journalist or a copywriter for John Lewis. A lot of my jobs have been office based, and that comes with some unique challenges. So it was nice to be freelance and have the luxury of writing this in bed. So it's for the New York Times. This is the last edit, so it's kind of uncut, but this is the last one before the edit. So, in my 20-year career as a writer, I've been fired more times than I care to admit, and I've even more resignation letters to my name. Work and paranoia aren't exactly a recipe for success. More recently, in the last 5 years, I've started to work from home, and that's been more fortuitous. Of course, stigma still looms over anyone on the schizo spectrum, but this isn't a piece about stigma. Sartre's quote that hell is other people rings true to me, and I work best with total autonomy away from others who can quite unknowingly start off my paranoia. In 2008, I was a fashion writer for over a year at John Lewis, and my illness caused some very real issues. In an office with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, I really couldn't cope. The paranoia was there from the go, and it seemed bars on the windows of the office were placed there just for me as part of a grand conspiracy. I've always felt that people are setting me up for heinous crimes, or that I've committed one and can't remember what it is, and that the police are spying on me to gather evidence. With the windows, I felt they'd been fitted by a stranger who knew me, sometimes before I started work, to send me the message I would soon be behind bars. Seeing a policeman on the street outside the office or a helicopter could also send my heart racing. I was convinced they'd finally come for me. The sedative effects of my medication, however, meant I could get into the office late, as I often overslept, really late, sometimes 90 minutes so. The head of department didn't seem to mind, as I always made up the time in the evening, but colleagues on my level did mind. I'm told by the writers that comments were passed on and my lateness was noted by the girl who sat next to me. Back then I wasn't open about my condition and didn't want to stigmatise myself by giving the reasons for my lateness, so I assumed people thought I was lazy. To this day I'm unsure if I'm a victim of bullying in the office or whether I was paranoid. It's hard to be sure of your own mind when you have a history of losing the grip on reality. I can only draw the conclusion that I was very sensitive to others, such as off-the-cuff remarks that you may hardly register, and rolling eyes, or people sighing when I arrive late, which can feel aggressive to me, threatening as well. I can still take a heavy breath as a negative action aimed as an insult towards me. A 9-to-5 office role is relentless. I didn't have time to see my therapist on a weekly basis, like I have had chance to do more recently, to work through my issues. I often forgot general checkups and many times forgot to reorder my medication at the doctor's surgery, meaning that every month I was in a mild panic attack when the pharmacy didn't have my meds to hand. Luckily for me, every office has its own underdog or pet hen. They usually gravitate to me as a kindred spirit and can calm and soothe me when I get paranoid. They take me aside to calm me down or nip out for a cigarette. I remember on one occasion where the colleague who sat next to me was glancing at my screen to see what I was working on. She glanced for about 10 seconds. This seemed like a long time. It seemed more like a stare. I got very angry and sent a strongly worded email to the company manager, with a few line managers copied in for good measure. I told them I felt I was being micromanaged by someone at the same level as me. The email was strongly worded enough that the colleague had tears in her eyes and was granted permission to leave work for the day. She even brought some chocolate to say sorry to me and mentioned more than once that she was Christian. Once I left that job, she deleted me on Facebook. By this point, she knew I had mental health problems. Another issue I have is flights of ideas that aren't conducive to settling into a regular routine of work, and that are compounded by the restlessness, which is a side effect of my medication. The fashion writer job was my dream job at a very decent salary. I'd been there for 2 weeks when I asked if it was possible I could take 6 months out and return to work as a trainee reporter on a local newspaper in Hawaii. That wasn't allowed, but 2 weeks later I took 3 days holiday and a weekend away, which was a little stressful, to go to Paris and write a deodorant review for a small magazine. I did that again in Switzerland for Vogue as well. I was so stressed on returning that I immediately booked in to see a private therapist, but I didn't check his credentials. Turns out the therapist wasn't qualified to treat people on psychiatric medication. He refunded me but refused to see me again. This just added to my feelings of desperation. Sometimes the flights of ideas won't stop. Another week I took a week off to host a writing workshop for people with disabilities. Before long I'd taken all paid holiday, but as I've been working on these days off, had no real break, which made me tired. It isn't all bad. With all this in mind, I've come to view myself as disabled in the workplace. Having schizoaffective and the health checkups and therapy time that entails means I'm only able to work part-time and flexibly. Home-based is best, as I struggle to get up and I struggle to get along with other people. The paranoia and obsessive reading between the lines makes it impossible to be around a group of people for much longer than a couple of days. At another office in 2009 where I worked as a copywriter, it still pains me to recall the time someone asked what I was listening to. I replied, Coldplay. to which the colleagues in the office all laughed. I'm unsure why. Maybe they found me as depressing as the artist I listened to. Once again, I felt like I was being bullied. I quit the job shortly afterwards, and I'd only been there a couple of months. An important lesson I have learnt about overcoming adversity and learning to live with mental illness is that we can build castles with the stones life throws at us. I now work from home hours to suit, mostly writing about my experiences with a severe mental illness, as well as others work in mental health, which I enjoy very much. I am writing my first book, A Beginner's Guide to Sanity, with a highly regarded professor of psychiatry. My current pursuit is to try and turn the flights of ideas into stories and new projects that I can work on, but not too many that I get overwhelmed. I made just £6,000 last year as a freelance journalist, but the freedom and work-life balance this gives me has been priceless, and I've seen very real and positive results for my mental health. Having a diagnosis, my diagnosis has changed from paranoid schizophrenia to schizoaffective disorder. I'm considered more social than those with schizophrenia diagnosis, but I do have occasional mood swings. Therapy has taught me qualities such as confidence and work-based skills can be learnt and built on. Most importantly, it has taught me that my work is a work in progress. So that's me in the office. I think it can be done. I think I just need to work on it. Maybe next year I'll start doing 1 day a week somewhere, and maybe I can focus on like working in a small team where there's not so many people getting on at me. But perhaps writing so candidly about my experiences, people will be a little bit more kinder, and maybe I can be a little bit more calmer. So psychosis in the media, there's a lot of scary headlines like Bonkers Bruno, and I think in the media as well, if you look at the Joker film, its portrayal of mental illness is quite a scary one. And I just wanted to make the point that this stigma, it's like I'm not immune to it myself. This is all I knew about psychosis before I got the diagnosis all those years ago. So when I was first diagnosed, I did think that I couldn't have children in case I murdered them. I did think that I was dangerous, and I thought, God, if I tell people that I've got psychosis, they're going to be so afraid of me. So I'm not kind of immune from the tabloid headlines or the stigma myself. I can kind of attach it to myself, and that can be quite scary. So one of the things I did to challenge that stigma in the media, I'm going to show, at the actual talk I'm going to show a film here, but I'll talk about it now anyway, is MedFed. Now MedFed is a fashion label I created. So I'll just talk you through some of the designs. One was a red bracelet, and it had diamond lettering that spelled out psycho. And I made that because I wanted to reclaim the psycho headlines and the kind of, psycho murderer on the loose headlines. And I wanted to make something really pretty, really glamorous, really slick and fashionable with the word psycho that people can actually wear. So there was that, and then there was another one, like I made a little handbag, and it had bunnies on, and it was bunnies having a party. And I wanted to reclaim bunny boiler, like it's an insult that some people will use to have a go at me. So I wanted to reclaim the bunny boiler insult, and it's just, like there's some cow prints that I did, and I wanted to reclaim Mad Cow, and all of this is done in the brightest colours, glitter, sparkles, neons, flowers, that kind of thing. And it's all done in the brightest colours just to challenge this kind of like either the dribbling vegetable that's incapable of doing anything, or the axe wielding murderer stereotype that we get. I mean, you don't say in the papers that that there's a cancer sufferer goes on a murder spree. I mean, it wouldn't be relevant if the person had cancer. it is just with psychosis and schizophrenia. It seems to make the headlines, and I wanted to do something to remedy all these crime stories with something fun, bright and happy, and that was the kind of fun, bright and happy was the tagline for MedFed. So I've done some work in that, and I went back to university a couple of years ago and spent 2 days a week developing that as part of a fine art degree. So I got a degree in fine art, and I did some really nice stuff with MedFed. I did a pop-up shop in the local Minds window. I did like a local window display, and we got the local papers to come down and cover it. And for once, the local paper had psychosis in the headline, but it was just me doing something fun with artwork for charity. And it was nice to get psychosis in the paper for that reason. So that's MedFed, and that's my way of challenging the stigma that I see in the press. So, Hope Scene. I brought some to show you today. This is Hope Scene. This is a magazine that I've been funded by the local council to produce, and its tagline is Rays of Light Amid the Darkness, and it's a magazine that tells inspirational stories of surviving either suicide attempts or surviving bereavement to suicide, and it's people's real stories of how they've overcome these adversities and why they're so glad that their suicide attempts were unsuccessful. And again, like I guess it's a step on from MedFed. I've used like bright, happy colours. There's like daffodils, yellows. On the back, it's a quote from Audrey Hepburn. It says, "Nothing is impossible. The word itself says I'm possible." And there's a nice picture of a sunflower and some sun. And yeah, I really think that storytelling is so powerful, and some of the stories I've read from other people with mental illness that have written their story have really changed the way an article can really change the way you feel about something. It can change your mind about something. I think just 1,000 words can have such an impact on someone, and I wanted to use that impact and that power. I wanted to kind of harness that to create these stories that are going to make people feel better. And these will be distributed, well, there'll be a website that's under development. It's up there now, hopezine.com. But then there's going to be hard copies of these distributed around Staffordshire, suicide hotspots such as train stations. We're trying to reach out to middle-aged men. So I guess we'll be trying to get it into construction warehouses and football stadiums to kind of give people hope. But I wanted to end the talk on something positive. So I was going to give you a short reading of a story that I made for this. It's a true story about to give people hope that I wrote. There's how it looks. It's called Never Say Never. And it's about an experience I had probably about 2 decades ago now in London. Having just been diagnosed with a severe mental illness and struggling to hold down a day job, I sought escapism watching Spooks. It's a TV programme I downloaded for after work each day in an office in South East London where I also lived. The days were hard, and I enjoyed Spooks so much I found myself falling for one of the lead characters, who a quick Google search told me was played by the actor Rupert Penry-Jones. The catch was that my even escapism was just that. The more I watched, the more my heart started to ache, for I would never meet Rupert in real life. He was always behind my TV screen. As the days passed, I'd soon watched every episode, but still dreamt of Rupert, and knew I'd never meet him. I just had to get on with my life. As you'll know, London property is expensive, so not long after I'd watched all these Spooks episodes, I took a weekend job as an usher at the Unicorn Theatre, a delightful brand new space where children can learn through plays. Within 2 weeks of getting the job and doing my training, the opening night arrived. I couldn't believe it. There were loads of celebrities there, Sherry and Tony Blair included. As I watched the cameras flash at the incoming celebrities, I noticed a family of 3 walking towards the scene and recognised the father. It was Rupert. He was coming to the opening night as he himself had a young child interested to see plays. I was so terribly starstruck, just in awe. As everyone took their seats for the first ever play, I took my position outside ready to sell ice creams. Then Rupert popped out and asked me where the gentleman's room was. I'll never forget this. My evening thoughts about Rupert previously when I'm having a bad day or thinking it's impossible that I'd ever meet him. Now I say never, and when I'm having a bad day, I always remind myself that day I met Rupert. Okay, so there's a bit of time for questions now. Thank you for listening.